Hi there! You call yourself a headphone enthusiast, isn't it? So please stop for a few moments and please hear me out. Today I won't tell you about the fastest or the cleanest headphone amplifiers out there, about a very small and affordable unit. Today I'll tell you about a beastly looking headphone amplifier, which sadly is one of the most expensive ones and some of the best sounding ones that passed through my hands. It's so big that I was unable to put it in this shot, but please don't worry, as I'll show you plenty of video b-roll so you can get the sheer scale of that unit. It's called Trafomatic PRIMAVERA, and let's check it out. As you can see from those shots, this thing is just huge. It's bigger looking than my 350 watt power amplifier, which mind you is huge as well. This is basically the biggest amplifier of any sort that passed through my hands. At 30 kilos, I believe, or slightly above 66 pounds, this thing is just huge, beastly, and it's really redundant talking about its build quality. I think it looks great for a tube amplifier. It's symmetrical. Thanks Odin, it has only 4 tubes and not a lot more, because tubes are very expensive. I really like looking at those view meters, especially when some modern tunes are playing and those are going something like that, so very cool. This is just a headphone amplifier, so it cannot work as a preamplifier. It will not drive passive loudspeakers. It was made only for all sorts of headphones, which is crazy and cool at the same time. Crazy because it's over the top, overkill and endgame as well. So on its front panel you'll find a 4-pin XLR jack, a double 3-pin XLR balanced headphone outputs, and a regular 1/4 inch headphone jack. On its back you will find an AC inlet, a ground on or lift switch just in case you have some ground loops, and of course a pair of RCA and XLR inputs. As for tech inside it, first you need to know that this is a single-ended direct heated triode amplifier, which uses a pair of power tubes and another pair of driver tubes. So in very simple terms, it's a transformer coupled full tube headphone amplifier. So this is not a hybrid, this is not an OTL. It also happens to be the very first full Class A amplifier. So I've tried plenty of Class A amplifiers before, but those weren't really full Class A amplifier. This one consumes 280 watts every single hour, and it provides 9 juicy watts of power per channel in 50 ohms, which also happens to be one of the most powerful headphone amplifiers out there. Most of its weight comes from those huge, oversized and custom transformers, which are made by Trafomatic Audio, so those are very high quality transformers. You can also see some cylinders in the front, and those are holding some Mundorf high voltage capacitors. And the last thing that you should know is that this is a zero feedback amplifier, so it's not using any kind of negative feedback or noise shaping techniques like others are doing, and for me that's very exciting because it's the very first amplifier that I'm testing, which is a zero feedback amplifier. If you want to know a lot more about its inner workings, about its tubes, about how everything works really, then please check out my written review, which I posted below, which contains about 4 times the information. It doesn't have a gain switch, and it constantly offers you a gain of 33 dB, so you should be careful about those IEMs on very sensitive desktop headphones. Alright guys, so let's check how it sounds with about 20 desktop headphones and a few IEMs. Let's check that out. First, I want to say that this is supposed to be a loaner unit, but after hearing it, after testing it for about a few months, I decided selling my benchmark HPA4, my 2 benchmark HB2 power amplifiers, which I used to drive the Huffman Susvara, and I purchased that Trafomatic PRIMAVERA in white, which I believe is the best purchase decision that I made last year. Last year because I have it for exactly 1 year. So I've got it in February 2022, so I had plenty of time to research, to listen, to test everything, IEMs, desktop headphones. So I'll give you a full in-depth review about the Trafomatic PRIMAVERA. And I'll skip the part about the burn-in, but I'll just briefly say that it needed a very long burn-in time. It sounded like garbage in the first day. There was no sub-bass whatsoever, no dynamics, it was very harsh. I didn't feel that power, those 9 watts of power. It was actually clipping with 5 Vara. Even I was not arriving at 12 o'clock and it was heavily clipping. 2 weeks later and that sub-bass came, so finally it was a lot more engaging, and 1 month later it was completely else. So it was very different sounding amplifier. After about 1 month of burning, I could finally feel all that power, its dynamics, its soundstage, and what a juicy, what an amazing soundstage. It just sounds massive, very deep, very holographic, very 3D. So simply put, this is the biggest sounding headphone amplifier that I've tried in terms of soundstage and depth. It's like listening to the limits of my headphones in terms of soundstage. And I have plenty of solid-state headphone amplifiers, high-end solid-state headphone amplifiers at my side, and you can check some of them in the associated equipment. And while some of those sound really amazing, they cannot match the PRIMAVERA in terms of scale, soundstage, depth, air all around the notes. It's just very different sounding. It's like having a pair of mini monitors, near-field setup in your office, always getting the sounds from a few meters away from your head. Besides listening to headphones for about 20 years now, something like that, I'm also part of a big hi-fi community, speaker file community, stereo guys that are listening to loudspeakers. And when I'm trying to talk with them about headphones, most of them will be changing the subject. For them, it's a boring topic, talking about headphones. But I invited a few of them checking out the PRIMAVERA with some open back headphones, and I do believe a month later I converted a few of those guys into headphone listening. They didn't get the PRIMAVERA, but they get pretty nice open back headphones. And I do believe that PRIMAVERA can bring some of those qualities from your stereo setup into headphone listening. And depth, soundstage, imaging are some of those things, that is for sure. If you know me by now, then you know that I really like fast transients, impactful transients. So for me, all those are very important because I cannot enjoy my music, electronic tunes, maybe some rock music without a thumpy, hard slumming bass and all those very fast dynamics, impactful dynamics. So I believe that mellow sounding amplifiers are dead on arrival, and people usually think about tube amplifiers or a few tube amplifiers as being mellow, soft, sweet, but too relaxing, very polite sounding. It so happens that PRIMAVERA is pretty much the opposite of that. So it's hard slamming the bass, probably the hardest slamming amplifier that I've heard with my headphones. It's very dynamic. It slams like crazy in the bass. And I believe it's one of the reasons why I sold those benchmark HPA4 and 2A HB2 power amplifiers, because this one is just thumpier, more impactful, more dynamic sounding with everything, not only with 5 Vara. It is so thumpy and so impactful and so dynamic that a lot of solid-state headphone amplifiers that I still have around the house, they felt a little polite, gentle sounding by comparison. Some of them can be faster sounding, and I believe IEMs I'm 23R is faster sounding, but in terms of dynamics, sheer bass punch, impact, I believe that PRIMAVERA is better than any of those. Usually I'm getting some hardness, some overly sharp contours, maybe a weird pitch in the treble with some solid straight electronics, but that is not happening with the PRIMAVERA. It sounds effortless, it's just pours naturally, it's very lifelike, real sounding. A few solid-state electronics, which I was telling you that use some sort of noise shaping techniques like THX, triple amplifiers, PLFC, NFC amplifiers that use negative feedback, negative loops, feedback loops, and feed-forward error correction. Those are always taking away something from your music, and that is life, because those sound quite fake, not that natural, quite dry in the mid-range, but that is not happening with the PRIMAVERA because it sounds real, lifelike, it sounds like real music. You just have a band staying in front of you a few meters away, and that is really how PRIMAVERA is sounding with all and really everything. Let's talk about its noise floor, but first I will remind you that this is a zero feedback amplifier, so it's not playing with the noise floor in any way. It just tries to lower it with high quality components, and that is all. And of course, you need to know that from 9,000 milliwatts of power per channel, just a single one is needed to drive these to ear deafening levels. So please be extra careful when playing with PRIMAVERA with ultra sensitive IEMs. It doesn't have a gain switch, and it always offers you 33 dB of gain, and also its power output is pretty much the same on single-ended and balanced, so please be extra careful with IEMs. Super loud levels were at about 13 out of 100, so I couldn't go much higher than that. And to my huge surprise, with ultra sensitive IEMs, I couldn't hear nothing playing in the background, so it was simply dead silent at my usual listening levels and at very high listening levels. And of course, that is a surprise because their head to headphone amplifier, also tube amplifier, was noisy at that level. It was noisy at the lowest volume position with ultra sensitive IEMs. But PRIMAVERA is not. So clearly this is a higher quality amplifier and high quality power at the same time. And while I couldn't go much higher than 15 out of 100, I could do that with Music Compose, of course, because I wanted to save my hearing. And at around 35 out of 100, which is, mind you, already Susvara levels of power, I could hear a whine, a white noise playing in the background. But that is already way too much power, and that is actually pretty normal. With all that said, it still has a lower noise floor compared to plenty of solid-state headphone amplifiers, which is actually quite a big surprise, as usually tube amplifiers are quite noisy with IEMs, but that is not really happening with the PRIMAVERA. So if you are crazy enough to use ultra-sensitive IEMs on such a beastly looking amplifier, you can do that pretty easily because it's really an IEM-friendly amplifier, and you can use any other desktop headphones, very sensitive IEMs like my Apos Caspian focal headphones, just you name it. All those would sound great on your usual listening levels. Alright guys, let's talk about power because I believe it's a very interesting topic. So it provides 9 watts of power per channel into 50 ohms. And that is one of the most powerful headphone amplifiers out there. With my planar magnetic headphones, I was sitting somewhere in between 9 and 10 o'clock volume-wise. With Sennheiser HD800, I was at 9 o'clock. With HD660 S2, I was below that point. So of course, there was always plenty of power remaining on top. The only headphone that was arriving at half of its power at 12 o'clock was only the Halfman Susvara, so again leaving plenty of headroom for some wild dynamic swings. It also happens to be the very first full Class A headphone amplifier, so it always provides power in Class A operation. It never moves to AB, how most headphone amplifiers are doing. And that's why all my headphones are sounding so alive, so engaging, so thumpy, so dynamic. It almost makes me rewrite and reshoot some of my headphone reviews, like for example the Halfman Susvara review. So if you go back to my Halfman Susvara review, then you can see me driving them with two benchmark HB2 power amplifiers, which made them so impactful, alive, very controlled in the bass. And I can say that PRIMAVERA is pretty much like that, so very much the same, with the exception that it sounds bigger, more holographic, more 3D. One of the main reasons of getting the PRIMAVERA was its ability to bring life into lifeless sounding headphones. So Halfman Susvara and Sennheiser HD800S are more or less like that. You need to work around them until they will sound great. You will need to use some very specific DACs, very specific headphone amplifiers, cables, until they will start singing. With Susvara, I've tried, I believe, around 30 amplifiers of all sorts, headphone amplifiers, integrated and power amplifiers. Only very few sounded great. But on the PRIMAVERA, it's like listening to the best version of the Halfman Susvara without any kind of drawback. And the same can be said about Sennheiser HD800S. Usually they don't have an amazing sub bass, their mid-range is quite dry, and their treble is a little brighter than usual. But with PRIMAVERA, I have nothing like that. I have all the bass, it makes them very deep sounding in the bass. The mid-range is considerably fuller, and weightier sounding, and there is no glare and listening fatigue in the treble. So again, it's like listening to the best version of my headphones, and not only these, but basically all. So Mesa Elite, Transients Phobos, Odyssey, LCD5, LCD4, any of those. It's almost funny because I didn't find tube amplifiers to be as powerful, as fast, as impactful before, but this one is a very different beast. It does justice to dynamics, to transient response, and it's certainly more dynamic sounding compared to plenty of solid-state headphone amplifiers, with the exception of IEMs I'm 23R, which is faster but not as impactful. Moving on to Soundstage, when PRIMAVERA pushed the sounds outside my head with a pair of Odyssey LCD5, then I understood that it has the potential of solving the biggest problem that we have with headphone listening, which is literally in the soundstage and depth. And I'll probably sound like a fanboy, a word which I really dislike, but with all my headphones, PRIMAVERA just provided an unlimited scale and soundstage. It was easily a 10 out of 10 in terms of soundstage. And a few headphones, they have by default a really nice scale, soundstage depth imaging like Sennheiser HD800, but other headphones, they need a helping hand until they will start spreading their wings and sounding big. Odyssey LCD4, for example, they will sound tiny, very shy on portable devices, and they will sound much bigger, 3D, with a much better depth on some beastly looking headphone amplifiers. And the same goes with many other headphones in my collection, you know, Mesa Elite, Transients Phobos, all those sounded much bigger, like getting the biggest sound I could get from such headphones. But the biggest change happened with Harman-Kardon and Odyssey LCD5. Odyssey LCD5, they sounded quite tiny up front, very claustrophobic, even with several solid-state headphone amplifiers, but with PRIMAVERA, that became manageable and much more enjoyable. Moving on to transparency and detail retrieval, people are usually associating tube amplifiers with soft, mellow, and sweet-sounding amplifiers, which are rolling off parts of the frequency response, especially in the upper treble and in the sub-bass. And that description fits plenty of entry to mid-level headphone amplifiers, but PRIMAVERA is not really part of that group. So I find PRIMAVERA mostly honest sounding, real sounding, without really rolling anything in the frequency response. Its treble output is actually excellent. There is plenty of shimmer, plenty of detail, but I'm not getting, you know, hundreds of needles piercing my eardrums as it might happen with a few solid-state headphone amplifiers. So I do believe it does transparency and detail retrieval very good. It doesn't have a problem with that. But the one thing that is not working that well are overly sharp contour or leading edges of the notes, because it's not really over sharp sounding in any way. The trebles are not exaggerated as it might happen with a few solid-state headphone amplifiers. I do believe that PRIMAVERA is more like honest sounding without really altering the frequency response, a skill that it mastered already. Moving on to frequency response, its bass was skinny, it was lightweight, it was lacking cojones in a way, it was very shy sounding in the first days. But as days were turning into weeks, it gained some muscle mass, it gained some confidence, it was much deeper, much more powerful. And a month later, it was nothing like it was in the first day. It was just amazing, much more powerful, much more defined. And that happened not only quantity-wise, but also quality-wise. And after listening to solid-state electronics for the biggest portion of my life, it feels like experiencing really high-quality bass for the first time. And the only solid-state headphone amplifier that can match it quantity and quality-wise, I believe, is the IEMs I'm 23R, which, as I was saying, it was slightly faster, but not as impactful. And considering that it feels almost limitless in terms of power output, I can say the same about its bass. It's almost limitless. It's very deep reaching, and it's powerful, and it's high quality and high quantity at the same time. Its mid-range performance feels like I'm experiencing their head-to-headphone amplifier all over again, because it's not overly warm, it's not overly sweet, overly smooth sounding, and more like I'm getting a real representation of the mid-range. So it's definitely a little textured, denser sounding and weightier sounding in the mid-range, but it's not overly smooth. It has just a sprinkle of that smoothness and warmth and life, but not too much of it. If you want, you can add a little bit more density in here by adding those new all-stock reflector tubes, but regardless of the tubes being used, it was never dry or lifeless sounding in the mid-range. Its treble performance is another standout because many times it feels like I'm listening to a really great solid-state headphone amplifier because it's extended in here, it's clean, it's detailed, there's plenty of vibration and shimmer, it's powerful with snare drum hits, and it's very precise with cymbals, but it's never bright sounding in the treble. Nonetheless, you can make it slightly faster, slightly more impactful, slightly cleaner. You can change its tonality with different tubes, and let's talk about tubes right now. First of all, I'm really glad that PRIMAVERA has 4 tubes and not more, because tubes are very, very expensive. I've got them all, and let's start with the driver tubes. So this one is the stock Softtech tube, which I've been using for about 5 months, which is pretty great sounding. It's fast, impactful, but it's not the cleanest sounding tube out there. And it has a slight bright tint in the treble, so you can do better than this. Next, following the Electro Harmonics gold pins, they have gold pins. These ones are more like a pimped out version of the stock Softtech tubes. So these are faster, more impactful, cleaner sounding, more transparent sounding. These are my daily driver tubes. And next are coming new all stock reflector tubes, which I've got from Ukraine. I've got A tubes, I believe. These are basically the warmer sounding tubes. They have an amazing mid-range, very full-bodied, sweet sounding mid-range, at the cost of a slight roll-off in the treble. So they work amazing with bright sounding headphones. Amazing tube. And let's move on to power tubes. So this one is SV811, which will be giving you a bigger soundstage, the biggest soundstage that you can get on the PRIMAVERA. They have a slight elevation in the mid-range, which is could be nice, at the cost of slightly less power compared to this tube. So this tube is not very linear sounding, it's more like warmer sounding and bigger sounding, something like that, but not as impactful sounding. So this one is more impactful, is slightly faster, the bass is fuller bodied on this one. They are more linear sounding in a way, these ones. They have slightly more power, and that works amazing with Hyphamas Susvara. So these are my daily driver power tubes together with Electro Harmonics gold pins that are making PRIMAVERA natural yet very clean and impactful at the same time. Alright guys, conclusion time. PRIMAVERA doesn't have excellent measurements, it's hot after a few hours of use, it's not the fastest, it's not the cleanest amplifier out there, and its tubes have a limited lifespan. In spite of that, with my headphones, with my music, this is pretty much the best sounding headphone amplifier that always puts a smile on my face. And you must be wondering why and how in hell I switched from perfect measuring DACs and perfect measuring headphone amplifiers to less than perfect measuring units. The thing is, I don't follow measurements anymore. I don't care for them as much. I don't listen to sine waves. I don't care how many zeros are behind my amplifier distortion. If a unit makes me feel great, if I'm nodding my head, if I'm toy tapping, if I'm smiling, for me that's more than enough. Actually, I don't need that much to be happy, just a kid playing around, some old rings, a few smiles a day, and some music playing in the background. For me, that's more than enough. I won't push you making some wild purchase decisions. This thing is still extremely expensive, more expensive than it needs to be. But still, nothing plays like it, and nothing really unlocks my imagination as it does. It played some tricks on me, and it will surely play some tricks on you, and of course, it goes without saying that it won my highest gold award. Alright guys, a much longer in-depth review can be found below. It literally contains about 4 times the information, so please check that out. And as usual, listen to my tunes, be positive, and I'll see you soon. Cheers!